Would you like to start?
Certainly. So I'm Clayton Cox. I got my PhD in 2012 from the University of Florida in the field of microbial ecology and food safety. I then did a 2-year postdoc funded by the USDA at University of Florida working on the food safety of tomatoes. Kind of leaving the academic track, I'm currently serving as a AAAS American Society for Microbiology Congressional Fellow. I work in the office of Congresswoman Louise Slaughter and primarily handle antimicrobial resistance and food safety, so still actually use the literature in that role and still trying to publish some data from the postdoc anyways, so hopefully another paper or two come out.
Hello, my name is Shelby Kimmel. I'm a postdoc at the University of Maryland, where I study the theory of quantum computing. So that's a pretty interdisciplinary field. So I'm currently in a computer science department, but I got my PhD at MIT in physics. And so I publish about half and half, kind of more on the physics side and half on the computer science side. Yeah, I think I'll start with that for now.
Hi, my name is Matt Hartings. I'm an assistant professor of chemistry at American University here in DC. I got my PhD in 2005 from Northwestern, postdoc at Caltech. So I do a lot of work on, I guess, bio-inorganic chemistry, so metals and biology. So a lot of work with proteins, some enzymes, materials, things like that. I also teach a class at American called The Chemistry of Cooking, so we've got a little bit of food up here on this panel. And that's for really engaging non-scientists with science and with chemistry in a way that's not normally done. Let's see, what else did I want to say? Yeah, so the other things I teach Gen Chem and I teach inorganic chemistry. But really, you know, my research focus is on really materials and nanocomposites and using proteins to make nanocomposites and things like that. So that's my background.
Hi, I'm Paul Hess. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Maryland. I'm part of a center called the Joint Quantum Institute, which is a NSF-funded Science Frontier Center. I did my undergrad at Williams College, and I earned my PhD last year from Harvard. So I've been in my research group here in Maryland for a little less than a year now. So I work in experimental physics, and so a lot of the tools of my trade include things like lasers and optics, using ultra-high vacuum chambers to study kind of the properties of atoms and molecules. And the motivations of my research sort of have ranged from very big picture questions about cosmology in my PhD to now kind of studying quantum mechanics at like a very fine scale and doing research that's motivated by kind of learning about new quantum mechanical materials. I guess some of the big journals that I've used most frequently for my research kind of include a lot of the physical review journals, so PRL and PRA, Science and Nature, and frequently checking the Quantum Physics Archive is also sort of a big feature of my research, I guess.
Okay, so you have our researcher's profile. I have told them that they could expect any and all questions from the audience, so by all means, don't hold back. This is really open to any topics you'd like. Do we have a first question, or should I fire away first? Could the other corner of the room hear the question? Okay.
So let me take a crack at that. One of the things that when I'm sitting down to write a paper, sometimes I have a journal in mind, and sometimes I don't. One of the things that really tends to drive me crazy are document templates and things like that. You know, everybody has some. You know, you send out a paper for review, and sometimes it gets a desk reject, right? And I think that's one of the most frustrating things that I have as a researcher is when I put all this time into formatting just for the journal and do all of this stuff and it gets either a desk reject or rejected after review. I don't. This kind of gets to your question, and I'll get to your question in a little bit. As far as coming from a publisher, I think that's not necessary. In my point of view, I don't know that that's necessary because your paper might not end up with that publisher, right? So I think that's my opinion on that. We do work. I have worked collaboratively on papers. And really it's just using Google Docs so far and maybe Mendeley or EndNote sharing libraries, things like that, so you can work collaboratively. But I think one of the things that I am concerned with things coming from a publisher is what happens when your paper doesn't end up with that publisher, and that's sort of I don't know. A frustration of mine is the need to conform to a template and have things like that. If the paper gets accepted or if it gets sent out for review, I'm happy to change formatting immediately and do all the work I need to do that. But it should be up until a point. The formatting requirements should be a minimum, and so from that end, having that control at the publisher's point of view, I think making tools for collaborative writing, I don't necessarily know is in the best interest of the publishing group.
So, I'd like to also add that if you were to consider something like that, it certainly could be very useful, but you need to consider a researcher's time. It tends to be the most valuable thing. And anything that was developed would have to be very simple and intuitive, something very easy to grasp, because there's a lot of trust. I mean, you mentioned Google Docs, like, oh, everyone already uses it. Honestly, I wrote a grant with my PI and an outside collaborator. It was actually my postdoc application. Tried to get them to use Google Docs. They spent maybe a day working on it, and we couldn't figure out whose track changes were where, and just completely abandoned. And as far as I know, the lab still does not use Google Docs. They didn't as of 9 months ago. So it's a great tool. I use it outside of that, but uptake can be slow simply because people just value their time, and it's easier to do what they already use. Same thing with libraries, your journal libraries that researchers keep. If it's not going to be something that is easy to share and integrate, you just don't have time to go back through thousands of your documents and switch them over. So,
I would just say my favorite tool for collaborating with is GitHub, which is kind of a line-by-line tracker. And so, I mean, in my field, I write everything in LaTeX. So for us, I don't know, maybe the formatting isn't as big of a deal. You just download whatever template and cut and paste your text, and it's very easy to switch formats. So.
Yeah, I guess I'll add one more comment about collaboration. So in the past, I've used a program called Share LaTeX. I also write my articles in LaTeX, which is, essentially just a change tracker, but it also has a compiler, a web compiler built in with it. So it's a nice way to sort of collaborate across platforms. But again, sort of answering Clayton's comment there, it was also sort of hard to even get our relatively small research team of about 10 people to, accept that platform. And in terms of knowing where you're going to submit an article to beforehand, it definitely depends on, I would say, the scope of your work. I guess even for this sort of big result that I was working on in my PhD, we had one journal in mind, and then sort of at the last minute we ended up switching to another journal. So if I was using some platform-specific format, we'd probably have to take all of our texts and switch it over to some other format or something, which would definitely have been a problem for us. And I would say in our current work, you kind of, you're working on some result and you have some goal in mind, but sometimes the data just isn't always there. And so then you end up having to kind of, reduce maybe the scope of what journal you apply to from your sort of initial hopes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, David, of course.
Sorry, so I've got a follow-up. How many people know what GitHub is? So I'm genuinely interested. You might want to explain to people that don't know what GitHub is. And then how are you using it exactly?
So GitHub, I guess I'm not even that technologically savvy either. But I mean, it's basically GitHub is mostly used for people who are writing large code, like a large program, and it allows different people working on the code to kind of take out the sections that they're working on and only change small sections and kind of debug things on their own. And then it very easily integrates, once you've made changes to your section, it kind of automatically merges your section back with the main code. But so I use it to just write papers, to write, LaTeX documents. So, I'll just take out, you have a local copy that's there's like the master copy is up in the cloud somewhere, and you kind of have a copy of that on your computer. And then I make changes, and if my collaborators also make changes, even if we're working on the same section, it has such a good merge software that it'll just kind of automatically put our changes, back together in a very intuitive way. So it allows you to track what changes you're making, and it also doesn't freak out if you're both making changes on the same section. So for me, it's amazing. It is a small bit of a learning curve, so I'm always convincing my collaborators to work on it. But for me, I'm usually working with 1 or 2 people, maybe. So, yeah, it's been great for me. I mean, there's a complete log of every version that you've ever made. So you can always go back to a previous version. You can see line by line the changes that you've made. So, yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned Google Docs, Mendeley, and note sharing coming to your world. Does it depend on who you're working with?
So one of my functions at American is we're primarily an undergraduate university, and as a teaching tool, and as a way to get our young researchers online with how research works, we like to have our paper writing process open to our undergrads who are in lab with us so they can see what's going on and see how we change things and see how we revise things. Google Docs is also something that our university generally uses, like for when the students have to write papers and things like that, they just go right to Google Docs and do it and submit everything through Google Docs. So they're used to working on that anyway. So I think for us, and personally, it's just something that's come about naturally for us in doing that. I will say, coming from my PhD and postdoc at 2 very established research groups, you follow along with how the PI does things, right? And my PIs who are now, I guess they're pushing 75 and 80, right? They sit down and write their papers, and they have their ways of doing things. And really for a lot of us, right, who are working in big research groups, and that's certainly not me at the moment, but having been through that world, I mean, these are the people who are doing lots and lots of publishing, and there are some people who do lots and lots of publishing who are very set in their ways. So for me, and again, this is just speaking from personal experience, the Google Docs and the sharing came out in a very sort of organic way, just because that's how the university runs things for the undergrads anyway.
the question is about how much content you actually consume in full text versus abstracts and TOCs, and how much do you end up saving for later and not necessarily using. So what, table content. So yes, how do you really consume the actual content of the articles? Is that fair?
Yeah, so this is probably a good one just to go down the line, but I'm sure everyone's different. But for me, as in a microbiology lab, you typically work with dirty hands. It's a wet lab, so papers are something you go to kind of, you're either starting an experiment or typically ending an experiment, and or you have a technical problem, so you have some downtime. So generally, I would go in, and I personally like to use either Web of Science or PubMed, search for the articles, and then just scan titles and abstracts, and anything that looks interesting, I'll pull and save. Generally, we'll read the abstract. If it's on topic, I'll open up the PDF and scan the figures and the graphs to kind of see. Sometimes abstracts are misleading, kind of what the work they actually did and how it would apply to me. I would say on average, maybe 5 to 10% of the articles I will read like right away within an hour, within seeing them to the next hour or two. A lot of what I save, you'll try and get back to, but maybe honestly a third to half of what I download I'll actually read the full version of. And well, if you actually really talk about the full version, all the text, less than that. But you'll go in and read the sections that are interesting, the results, the discussion. So, and yeah, there's a lot you just don't get back to, unfortunately. So, at least me.
Yeah, I would do a lot of reading of abstracts. So I'm on the archive every single day. Also, I use SciRate, which is kind of an archive upvoting service that quantum computing people use. So I use that very, very regularly, and will read abstracts and I would say introductions of a fair number of papers, but the full article, it happens honestly pretty rarely, only if I'm really going to be doing research and very closely related. So I would say only maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks I read a full journal article.
I kind of have the same experience in that, a lot of times there are a couple of journals that I go to every week and will look at the table of contents, but it's only just a handful. Most times it's going to Web of Science or for me SciFinder, things like that. I'm going to take a slightly different track here for a minute. A lot of the complaints I hear from the academic world and from the research world in general is that a lot of researchers say, where are all these new journals coming from? How can I possibly keep up with all these new journals? And there's lots of laughing in the audience. And there are good reasons to have new journals, but I think it's something that we as researchers are somewhat skeptical of, right? And again, there are good reasons to have new journals, different scopes, different focuses, things like that. On the other hand, on the other side of that, though, if no one is if people aren't just sitting down to look through that journal in total all the time, if it's there as a repository, right, that someone's going to find them on, Web of Science, PubMed, some other indexing service, right? There needs to be a reason, if the function of having that full journal, if it's something more than just being a repository, then sometimes sometimes the publisher needs to do a better job of driving interest to that, right? And making a researcher say, I want to sit down and look at that when it comes out. And I don't know, I certainly don't know the answer to that question. And I don't know if this is driving part of why you're asking this or not, but it's just something that we oftentimes talk about in the research world.
So yeah, my experience is very similar, I would say, to everybody else. Mostly I'm just scanning even titles. First the title, if it has something relevant in there, I'll look at the abstract. But then, maybe reading sort of one full paper a week, but that's, maybe reading 50% of the paper or something. Unless I'm really kind of starting a new line of inquiry and am doing a thorough literature search. I would say one thing that sort of helps me, I don't directly read the article, but get more exposure to research outside of my field are, some of these sort of perspectives or summary articles that are, published by various journals, or, the physics viewpoint or something like that, which is, I actually get a paper copy of Science, which I get through a fellowship, but so it's sort of nice looking through there and seeing these summary articles and learning some science that's outside of my field. But if I actually go to the article that's then written by the scientists, it's completely opaque to me. So I would say a very small fraction of the articles that are published in any given journal, even if it's sort of within your subfield, are accessible to a given researcher. Things are just sort of have become so focused.
Oh, wow.
There are some follow-up questions on that. We'll start here.
Hi, I'm Sarah Whalen. I work for Clayton Science, and I was just wondering what the most important factor is in figuring out which journal you're going to submit to. Is it impact factor, speed of publication, several colleagues have published in that journal?
Okay. So the question is, what are the most important factors when you decide in which journal you're going to publish? We'll go in reverse order.
Yeah, I'd say impact factor is a big one. And honestly, researcher preference is sort of larger than you might expect. So my advisor for my PhD only publishes in physical review letters. If it's not good enough for physical review letters, he won't publish it. And he doesn't consider publishing in anything else. The culmination of my PhD was actually published in a different journal. It was published in Science, but only because I collaborated with 2 other PIs who were able to twist his arm into publishing there. So yeah, it's sort of interesting, I guess, how these decisions get made. And I think he's just kind of being a little bit old school. But yeah, also having the ability to if there is I guess having other options to submit articles to, if you initially apply for something within the same sort of family of journals, so you don't have to restart the process over again, that also maybe affects our decision a little bit.
So as a newish PI, my motivations are somewhat different, right? So I am very concerned about getting through the tenure process, and everyone has motivations, right? No matter what level you are at, and all of you guys have your motivations as well, right? But my motivation is getting through the tenure process, and tenure requires that I get good external letters, and so the people who are writing for me, I need whoever they may be to see the papers that I'm writing. And that can be through high impact factor journals. But as a new PI, that's not necessarily sometimes my best option. So I need to publish in places where the people who are going to be reviewing my tenure package are going to see these articles. All right, so that's one important thing. But also, right, the other important factor for getting tenure and that process is getting grants. And so the people on the review panels also need to be seeing these. So if I can't get into a high impact factor or a just sort of a historically well regarded or flag bearer sort of journal, right? Then it needs to be in some place where the people who are going to be reviewing that grant are going to be seeing my paper. And hopefully, right, the hope with all of this stuff is, right, as a young faculty member, is that they've seen your work before you submit either a grant for them to review or your tenure package for them to go over, right? And so really, that's where some of these sort of area-specific journals can help. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So, yeah, I mean, impact factor may not be the primary driver, but just historical reputation, right? And a lot of times the high impact factor journals have a historical reputation. It's just the way things work sometimes. From my field, I think one of the journals that's different is Nature Chemistry. So Nature Chemistry is what, 5, 6 years old, something like that. But their impact factor is like in the 20s, right, close to 20. And for such a young journal, it's pretty amazing. And they've done really well for themselves. But if people want to say that impact factor doesn't matter, well, if not directly, but you know the quality of the publication, whether you're looking at the impact factor or not in study section, right? They see where you're publishing, and they may not calculate in their head, well, the impact factor of this is there, that, and the other. Their H index must be this, that, or the other. You know how well people are doing in publishing just by looking at names of journals. And that reflects, impact factor is reflected in that, whether people want to admit to that or not.
Oh, sure. So impact factor is an important factor for me, but actually I think there are a lot of other issues that go into it. So when I publish in computer science, so I don't know how many of you know, but for computer science, the most prestigious way to publish is through conference proceedings. So for that, obviously you want to go to a conference that is prestigious. But for example, since I publish in quantum computing, I could decide between, say, going to specifically a quantum computing conference or one that's more general computer science. So, it's not just the impact factor of once it's published in the proceedings, but I'm actually going to be going to a conference where I'll be able to interact with other people in my field. And so I have a decision about whether, maybe I could go to a slightly higher, a more prestigious computer science conference, but where less of the people there are actually interested in quantum computing, versus maybe a slightly less prestigious quantum computing conference where everyone is going to be much more excited and interested, and maybe the actual impact on the community might be a bit larger. And then I would just say the only other thing is if all things were completely equal, I would tend to prefer, say, going into an open access journal.
So yeah, I think our lab is similar. Certainly impact factor is considered, but the field of kind of bacterial interactions and food safety is not necessarily a huge field. And it's not an insanely applied field, but it's not like a fundamental thing that's going to develop a lot of nature science papers, and that's just a reality of what we do. So our lab really liked a couple of the more focused journals. There's a couple that they normally target. Definitely ones that in the field are well known, but the impact factor is not real high. I mean, I can't really think of a journal specific to that field that has an impact factor above like 5 or 6. It's a small field. So our choice was kind of based on reputation, which once again we feel like is reflected in that journal's impact factor. And to specifically answer your question about time to publishing, it's a secondary consideration, but honestly for our lab, kind of my PI's philosophy was, even if you were to look at maybe a lower impact factor journal that people would quote unquote say is easier to get an article published in, maybe perception is they have a little bit lower standards in the review panel, that process still takes just as long, and typically the reviewers will ask, in your opinion, maybe unnecessary demands of your paper that they will in a higher impact journal. So why not just go for the top level journal, since you're likely to do the same amount of work anyways. So that could maybe be a consideration. I know specifically we publish in microbiology. We use the ASM family journals quite a bit, not always. But it's kind of nice to know that there is that family of journals that you can maybe kind of find the right home for your article. We also use special editions a lot as a way to drive viewership more. It's a lot easier for people in food safety to pick up the food safety microbiology special edition than it is to comb through other articles. So.
Okay. Okay, so thank you. Somebody picked up on Shelby's comment that all things considered, she would choose an open access journal. So I don't know how many people were going to ask that question, but I certainly had it. Shelby?
I mean, I just know for myself, it's much more convenient if I'm, if I'm at the University of Maryland and I'm on their servers and then I have access to whatever I want, they have access to most journals, so then that's great if I'm looking for something. But, it's frustrating. If I'm traveling, I'm on my iPhone in the airport and I just want to see articles. I guess I've grown up in this world of where I'm in a field also where everything is on the archive. So it's almost always kind of open access in a way anyway, since we have the archive. But I just feel like I want people to be able to read my work, and it seems like if it's open access, that's going to make it the most easiest for the most people all over the world to read it.
Matt, can you react to that?
Well, you guys know this better than any of us up here, but someone's got to pay to get these articles published, and whether that's open access or traditional library subscriptions, the money has to come from somewhere. I think a lot of us in this sort of younger demographic are more likely to go open access. I think that's generally true for what Shelby just said. I mean, if you'd like to be able to access papers from wherever you are. But I would also say that open access is something that I feel strongly enough about that when I write grants, I ask for money to get to get money for paying for open access. But that's also something that researchers have to start doing also if they're willing to do that. I'm at an undergraduate institution, so I'm not publishing 20 papers a year, and it gets expensive really quickly. So I don't necessarily want to speak to that for someone at a Research 1 type school with a big research group. Yeah, I think it's open access is a good thing, and it's something that a lot of us are really wanting to happen. But I mean, the realities right now are what they are. I don't know if anyone else wants to.
I'll add in the lab that I came from, I don't think we had published anything open access to this date, unless some of the new stuff, but I doubt it. And that was primarily a cost concern. The feeling in the lab was that open access would be preferred, but it's a substantial cost barrier, and our lab just didn't have the funding for it. Sorry. Second point, now that I'm not working in a lab and I'm working actually in Congress, open access is a big deal for me. To it that the Library of Congress would literally get me anything I wanted, and that is not true. I probably have access to about a quarter of what I did coming from the University of Florida, which is pretty disheartening. You can get quite a bit, but there's a lot higher chance that I will read an article now if it's open access. And believe it or not, there are people in Congress that still access science, and I'm sure in other fields as well. So if you're thinking about the reach of your article beyond traditional academic researchers, open access for a lot of people is a huge deal in their ability to see it.
I want to add one more thing that I just thought of. So again, working at an undergraduate university, we try to go through and train our students the best way to look up journals and journal articles and things like that. And even after we go through training on Web of Science or PubMed or SciFinder or whatever it is, they still go to Google and they pull up Google, and something will come up and they'll click on it. And if they don't have access, they go to the next thing. And it's just how they operate. Maybe that's telling for what the future is bringing and how we need to be reflexive in that manner. But it's how they work. It's how my students work, and I'm sure that's typical for a lot of people. And now that you're at working for a congressperson, right? That if you're going and looking for an article, if you open it up, if you can't get it, you just move on to the next one.
I mean, like you were saying earlier, the AAAS program does give some background, so sometimes you're able to get stuff. But yeah, if I can't get it, I just can't read it now. That's just reality.
Paul, do you want to come in?
I'll just add one more thing about the sort of pricing structures for this. But for example, the University of Maryland libraries have a program where they will, if you have a need, they will help you fund submitting to an open access journal, which is, I think, is a great program, but I think it's a pretty small program. So as interest in publishing in open access grows, which I think it will, that I don't know how sustainable that sort of model is. So, I mean, maybe it is, but the money has to come from somewhere. So, yeah, I think solutions need to be found to this problem because there's a lot of interest. My group just published our first, well, we'll soon be publishing our first article in an open access journal. So, there's a lot of interest.
Yeah, the question is about other metrics that have come out, like alt metrics, and whether they play a role alongside the impact factor.
So at American, we have a fantastic science librarian, Rachel Borchert, who just wrote a book with one of our former librarians, Robin Chin, who's now at University of Washington, on different uses for alt metrics in scholarly publishing. So it's so new that I need to go steal a copy from her so I can read it. Our library doesn't have it yet. So it's just come out, but Rachel's fantastic and has thought about this a lot. So, again, what are my motivations? My motivations are to get tenure and to get grants. And after you go past getting tenure, your motivation is to get grants. And so who's looking at these things at the alt metrics? I like alt metrics, and I am going to be using alt metrics in my tenure package because I understand how to use them and how to try to influence my tenure committee on the importance of these things, right? And again, coming from an undergraduate institution, right? So I can't cite my H-index as being so awesome, right? Because I'm not putting out 20 papers a year. So I can use alt metrics to try to do that. But again, once you get past that, who's looking at them? I know HHMI will look at them for some of their big awards, but if you go to NIH or NSF, unless the researcher is pushing, saying, look at my alt metrics, until that really happens en masse, I don't know that there's a lot of push for that. I think they're incredibly useful, and I think they're great tools. But within the group of researchers, I think we have a lot to learn from how we sell ourselves with alt metrics yet. H-index and impact factor are easy, and I know that's why we use them and you use them, is because they're easy and they're there. Alt metrics might tell you more. They'll tell you different things. That's certainly true. And understanding how to use those is still really important.
I'm not really familiar.
Yeah, I guess I don't know what alt metrics are. So.
Okay. Neither do I.
Okay. Paul, same thing.
Yeah.
From this side of the room, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Emily Solomon, AI Publishing. Earlier, you mentioned that working with journal templates is kind of a pain, especially if you have to change years, go to a different journal. So besides that, I'm just wondering, what are some of the other pain points happening? Publishers and journals help you save time, go through the process more easily.
Okay, so thank you, Emily. The question is, what are some of the pain points that you have to deal with, and how can publishers help you to overcome them?
I can start. So I think in my experience, this is improving, but it definitely still has some work to do. So, for example, I mentioned before, we always write the sort of copy of our articles in LaTeX because we have a lot of equations in them, and it makes the formatting very easy. And I know that previously some journals had only accepted, say, Word document formatting. And so, I had a colleague who had written it all in LaTeX and then had to go back and rewrite it all in Microsoft Word, including the equations, which was sort of not as good at the time. When I then, a year or two later, published in the same journal, it was to the point where we could submit in LaTeX, but it was then sort of rewritten by the editors in Microsoft Word and then submitted back to us. But there were a number of typographic changes or typographic errors and some of the problems in equations, which a few of them, even after a few rounds of sort of back and forth with the editors, it was we almost missed a few kind of mistakes. So I think having some sort of format, definitely widely accepting all of these. I don't know if there's sort of other, code-based typesetting formats or something besides LaTeX that are out there. But being able to accept from all these different formats is really useful. And maybe having some sort of, more two-way kind of frequent conversation with the editors or something, or some sort of web portal or something where you can see changes in the document and be able to sort of try to fix them faster or get more eyes on them or something might be useful.
So yeah, just to add a little bit to that, two other pain points I can think are really just the formatting. I don't have experience with templates, but the journals I'm familiar with, they just have online instructions, but they're a couple pages, and it takes a while to read them, and they get very specific. And to be quite frank with you, my feeling was I'm a researcher. I get paid to do microbiology, and then I also pay the publisher to publish this journal article, so why do I have to then spend a day reading the instructions and then a long time also formatting my article? I don't know if that's fair, but that was honestly my personal opinion. So I think the more open you could be to just accepting the format that a researcher is comfortable publishing in, the more willing they would be to consider your journal. Because, especially now, like I mentioned, in our lab, we like the ASM family of journals, and their instructions are pretty much the same. So I know those instructions, and now I know what they want, and I have my old documents that I can work from. If I was looking to publish somewhere else, that's a mental barrier for me to go in, now I have to understand what their specific formatting requirements are, which I'm sure makes it easy on the publisher's end, but I don't write in that format natively. So, I don't necessarily understand why you want it that way. And the other pain point is the graphics. Maybe microbiologists aren't so good with numbers and making graphics and stuff. I don't know how the publisher can help with that, but that's something that also takes a tremendous amount of time. Once the research is done, we've plotted the data how we need to then make, scientific judgment on it, but then to get it in a format that looks good in the publication is more difficult and takes a tremendous amount of time. So. And to be honest, if you look at the microbiology papers, it's not done very well. So there's definitely room for improvement there.
I think it's always about time, researchers' time, and how much time they have to spend on things. Another point, and this is just a random one too, recently we submitted a paper and got decent reviews, but not good enough reviews for the journal that we were going through. And so we stayed within the same society and submitted to a different journal. And then you just have to, for whatever reason, we had to input everything, including all the authors, all the author addresses, and everything like that. It seems like there should be, and I know a lot of publishers probably have an easier way to repopulate those fields, again, when you're resubmitting an article that has been submitted already to the same society type thing. But an easier way to do that. Again, it's all about time and how we are spending our time. Along the lines of what you just said I had one experience recently with a paper that we submitted where an editor got back to me and said, you did your table this way. We think it would look a lot better if you did it like this. And that was really awesome. I'd never had that happen before, but it was really nice to be able to interact with an editor in that way.
Agree.
In the back.
Clayton from the American Chemical Society. I had a question. You talked about your reading habits and getting articles and reading the text. And I was wondering how important it is to you to actually have the data behind the graphs, the data behind the figures,
I think a lot of it depends on the field that you're publishing in. I know certainly in chemistry there have been some issues with doctored TEMs and SEMs and NMRs and things like that. And that's, I think that's one primary push for why people want to see the data, is just to make sure that what you're submitting is good, right? You want to see the original files or have access to the original files. And I think part of that, I don't think it's personally, I don't think it's the publisher's responsibility to hold the primary data. I think as a field, no matter what field you're in, but within your field, we need to figure out repositories or ways to have a place to locate your data so other people can find it. And that may be through libraries. I know a lot of library services now have to deal with just data storage. And you know, it's something new for a lot of librarians, but it's something that they're being tasked with doing more of. Certainly, I think that journals should think about how they provide links to that data. I don't think it's a journal's responsibility necessarily to provide the server space for that data. Is that kind of?
Yeah. I would add software to the equation as well.
Yeah.
To expand it, this data. But yeah, thanks.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I think this issue of how to properly share data is really important. I mean, I think it can be done well, but it requires a lot of time on the researcher's part to put the data in a format that would be usable for anybody who's requesting it outside of, you know, the research group who's developed that data. At least in my field, I mean, the data is usually pretty opaque, and there's a lot of, you know, sort of calibration files or something, very sort of specific things that need to be grouped with your data in order to get out a meaningful result. But I mean, you know, very large experiments like, you know, the LHC, I mean, they've very good at, you know, sharing their data amongst, you know, a worldwide user community, and, you know, researchers from all over the place can pull out, you know, meaningful results from that data. But yeah, on a small scale, it's hard. And I mean, we, you know, from some of the experiments I've worked on, we generated, you know, several terabytes of data. So, you know, if you're storing that can, if you have that coming from a lot of different groups, that can become, you know, a large sort of data burden to store. Yeah, and I mean, also sort of, I feel like there need to be better guidelines laid out for, you know, I think there needs to be a plan from the start in the research group as to how to share their data and sort of, you know, what format to put it in, and also, you know, is it the barest raw data that you're putting on some server, or is it after some degree of post-processing, or is it, you know, I generated this plot and literally here are the points that are on the plot or something, and that's it. But yeah, I think there's sort of, if this is going to be required, which I know, you know, funding agencies are saying that it's required, and on some of our previous work, I think, you know, we were funded by the NSF, and I think they said that, you know, our data has to be accessible, but it's not uploaded anywhere. We just have backup copies in our lab that if people request them, we'll give them the data. But yeah, I think sort of a lot of these things need to be laid out beforehand, and I agree. It doesn't really seem like that should be the publisher's burden. It seems like it should be maybe sort of part of the way you get funding. If the funding agencies are insisting on this, then it should be sort of written into your grant proposal or something.
Maybe I'll just plug GitHub one more time. That tends to be where my community also puts, if you write software, people tend to post it there very, very regularly, and then there's kind of a public version of GitHub. You know, when I'm writing a paper, it's not public, it's private, but on the public version, you can find lots of different code for analyzing different quantum systems, things like that.
Yeah, in micro, pretty much everything is going to genetic sequence information. So, you know, perhaps if a publisher had a way to make it more helpful to find, you know, exactly what that was. But most of that gets reposited by the researchers anyway, so it tends to be maybe less of a problem. But
All right. Yes, go ahead. here in the back? Okay, go ahead.
As a peer reviewer, I don't care about format. I really don't. I mean, so I'm usually reviewing papers from different journals to begin with that have different formattings and all of that. So it's not, I'm seeing different formats anyway, right? Formatting stuff is something for the publisher to be concerned with. As a peer reviewer, as long as there's a general guide, right? If you're reviewing a communication, right, and there's a length limit on that, right? So just a general. So typically a communication is, you know, if you want to say typically a communication is 3,000 words and 4 figures, something like that, right? General guidelines like that are fine, but as a peer reviewer, it doesn't concern me. I know a lot of my colleagues, again, who are at larger universities have a larger burden for doing peer review than I do. I do a couple a year, but some of these people who are publishing, you know, a lot more papers than I am get a lot more requests than I do for peer review, and they turn a lot down. So I don't know what the best and also as a peer reviewer, it's kind of my responsibility, right, being part of this community of scientists to do peer review. That's how we do things. So it's our civic duty, I guess. I don't think any of us are really looking for any reward out of it. I know there has been talk about figuring out a way to do that, but I think most of us just see it as a civic responsibility, something that we need to do for the sake of the field.
So, just a quick add. I like serving as a peer reviewer, but honestly, the biggest headache for the journal I was reviewing for was that it was a European journal, so I didn't have a reason to go to it very often. But every time I did, I had to put in my password to get into their system, and, you know, they'll ask you to review, and I may be very willing to review that paper, but, you know, maybe I'm in the middle of an experiment that's running the course of this week, so I won't get to it for a week or two. And then, you know, just as simple as like, oh, I got to remember my password, and it just kind of became a pain, and that really put you off the process, even though I would enjoy doing the work. So just make it as easy as possible for the reviewer who's giving up their time to participate in that process.
Any other comments? Paul, Shelby?
I agree with Matt.
So the questions are about supplemental data and how often you use them and how you use them, to very quickly summarize.
So one of the things my students are quickly learning is that the majority of the important stuff in a paper is in the supplemental. It just is. If you want to do the experiments, all of the experiments are in the supplemental. And this is happening everywhere, no matter where you publish. So supplemental is very important. And I think the supplemental is a place where sometimes things get through peer review, not under the intense scrutiny in supplemental. But as far as what I put into supplemental versus don't, you know, with any manuscript, I'm trying to tell a story, and if the data that I need to show is just supporting and is not a part of that story, then I'll put it in the supplemental. You want to be able to craft a good manuscript that reads really well and smoothly, and if the data doesn't fit into that narrative directly that you want to tell, then it goes in the supplemental.
Yeah, I mean, I also think supplemental information is very important, and often in articles that I'm reading really in depth, the supplemental information might be some more detailed derivations of, you know, formula that are in the main body of the text. And I mean, I think that's a good way to format it, because, you know, then when I'm reading the article, it's sort of been distilled to the most, you know, critical results, which, you know, maybe I can directly apply to my experiment. But if I want to take that and expand on their work or something. Be able to dig deep into those actual derivations is nice. And I feel like without supplemental information, that just wouldn't be published, or you'd maybe end up going to some thesis of somebody in that group and digging through there to try to look for these derivations. But it's kind of, I think it's nice to have them linked directly to the paper.
Just echo exactly what they said. I find it very useful.
Certainly those papers you have to read, right? If you're citing those papers, you're reading those papers. Yep. But I think what we might have been speaking to earlier is if you're scanning the newest issue or newest volume of a journal that's come out, right? You're scanning the TOC, scanning titles, maybe looking at abstracts. But if you're putting it in a paper or putting it in a grant, you have a responsibility to know and understand that paper that you're citing.
I think those two processes are somewhat distinct from each other. So, I mean, if I'm writing a paper, the papers that I'm citing are so closely related to that, whatever I'm writing about. I mean, that's kind of one subset. But I also want to know what's generally going on in my field, and that's what I use my kind of daily read through. And so I have some methods of tracking those papers, but the chances of my going back to like my list that I've made when I'm going through papers on a daily basis, that those end up in the actual citations is rare. I mean, when I'm actually starting a new research project, that's when I go through and look at all the relevant papers that seem to be very closely related.
So I think all of us, we have our daily read-throughs or whatever of journals, like once a week sitting down with a journal or couple journals and just seeing what's there. And oftentimes in that, I will find papers that I think may be useful down the road that I will archive directly, right? I'll click on the little button, save to EndNote online or save to whatever, and keep it in my library for whatever function of research that is. Doing that, having written grants and papers, I have a backlog of things that I've cited there's that library. But for new things, right, it is on those daily read-throughs, or if you want to make sure when you're writing a paper or writing a grant that you've gotten the most necessary papers or are describing things the way you need to, right? Web of Science, PubMed, whatever, finding citations that you might have missed before, saving those to your whatever archiving service that you use, reading them, all of that stuff. And then there are also, I'm writing a paper right now where I've got a result, and I think that result may be important for a field that I'm not in at all, right? And that's another place where I get new citations from and read new things. But really, my sort of weekly, when I'm looking at my papers, right, looking at my journals, there may be one, maybe two in the 3 or 4 journals that I look through. Those couple of articles that I'll save to my indexing service.
I feel like a lot of the times when I'm writing a new article, you'll go through, and a lot of those, I mean, kind of, the general structure, at least in terms of the references, is, the first couple paragraphs, you'll have these very broad references and, foundational work in some field or something. And then as you move more on to the methods in the article, there's these more kind of, focused references, I guess, you're citing. But I feel like, myself and others, you'll sometimes go through and you'll look at some of these previous papers, and then, a lot of these kind of high impact things that you're citing you're just taking those from some previous paper and you're saying, oh yeah, these were all these things they cited, and you read them and you sort of assume that this was the foundational thing, so you cite that again. But I've definitely seen that this propagation through is not really always done properly, and I've done some, when you do the reference tracing, then you say like, oh, was this really the first paper in that, and then you dig in deep through sort of other methods and you find out that it's not. So yeah, I feel like this task of properly citing things isn't necessarily always done right by the scientists.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think they pretty much covered it. So everyone's got their own process, but.
I think the other thing I'm trying to figure out yet is, so what's nice about living in DC is I take the train to work, right? And so when I'm sitting on the train, being able to pull up a paper onto my iPad as I'm sitting on the train doing nothing, right, is a great thing to be able to do. I'm still trying to get that process figured out for how I index the papers that I want to look at on the train, and whether I'm using Dropbox or Papers or whatever it is on my iPad. I'm still working that process out. So that might get a little bit to your question also. I'm thinking about it is what I'm really doing. Yeah.
So the question really is about scholarly collaboration platforms and how they've changed the way you're sharing and using the content. And are you accessing the content through the back door this way? Is this one of the tools that you use?
So I've noticed more and more, just in general, Google searches, right? ResearchGate's the first thing that comes up. Pretty much it's happening a lot now. Even before the Google Scholar references, ResearchGate is coming up. I do a lot of interaction on Twitter. I think Twitter is fantastic. There are a lot of researchers I talk with on Twitter and get and ask for suggestions on different papers or different processes and things like that. So I've used Twitter quite a bit for finding new papers or asking about papers. But, being at a smaller school, I'm the only inorganic chemist at my university, where I've come from places where there are, tens of inorganic chemists, right? So I can't go down the hall to ask someone about that. And so these tools, these online tools, whether it's ResearchGate or Twitter or other sorts of social media, are great for me personally because of that.
I don't really personally use social media to promote my work, but the Joint Quantum Institute, which I'm a part of, does have a sort of dedicated press office that does do social media and writes sort of their own internal press stories about press releases about the new publications from our center. So I think, yeah, having people who are willing to go there, and really, I mean, they're very sort of integrated with us, and they talk to us on, you know, a weekly basis about the science we're doing. So they have a really great understanding of all that stuff. And so I find their articles to be very good representations of our research. So I think that's a sort of nice way to promote the data.
I think another important thing in this new online world are things like PubPeer or the ability to comment on PubMed on articles. I think that journals should be linking to those, right? As for people who read and want to comment and discuss and do the post-publication peer review type of thing and talk about an article, right? It's nice that there's a single place you can go to or a couple places that you can go to. But I think journal articles should really start having not necessarily links, but facilitating people finding those places where this post-publication peer review is going on. I think anytime people are talking about a journal article, generally it can be a good thing, right? And so I think a lot of times in the academic world we see, oh, post-publication peer review, someone's just railing on this or talking about how awful something else is. But that's not necessarily true either. And I think facilitating that process would be something that would be great for more journals to start doing.
So the question is about peer review and whether you have a feeling about single blind, double blind, or completely open.
So,
Go ahead.
go ahead. I've got opinions.
All right, well, I'll keep it short. I think single blind is the worst way to go, to be honest. Yes. I mean, I haven't personally had any problem with it in my experience, but it does seem odd that as a reviewer you can see who wrote the paper, but the authors don't have that information. And I certainly think there's a legitimate concern that could influence the reviewer based on reputation or whatever. As far as whether double blind or completely open would be better, I'm not 100% sure.
I personally like the idea of open peer review, but it is dangerous for young researchers. As a young researcher, if I review a paper and am very critical of a paper and the paper is some senior person in my field, that there's a danger to me in doing that. The double blind is a good idea also. One of the issues around double blind certainly is whenever we write a paper, there are identifying things in that paper toward us. And so then I think it would be, and it's important to have those things, those identifying features in a paper if you're trying to build a narrative around all of your research. Then it becomes the journal's responsibility to figure out a way to get rid of that identifying information or change that identifying information during the review process. But I think double blind is a better way to go than the single blind. Yeah.
Well, in my field, double blind would be impossible because everyone posts on the archive, which is kind of this preprint service. So I mean, very, very rarely would someone not do that. So you can always just go and look at it and see, even if the journal has removed the identifying information. But one other option, which is maybe somewhere in between what the options that you suggested. So I mentioned this site SciRate, which is kind of an voting website that acts on top of the archive. And so I know that some journal or some conferences in the past have had kind of a public review system. So the the reviewers remained anonymous, but they posted the reviews onto the comment section of this SciRate website. So you started a conversation, actually. So you could see the conversation. People could ask questions of the author. And I mean, it's really interesting as a researcher, as you're reading the article, you can also read these comments. I mean, I find it very helpful, but it's also, you know, if I had an article where all these public comments, it would be a little stressful as well. So I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I think it's a really interesting option.
I agree that double blind would be difficult to implement even, I mean, besides articles being posted on the archive, but, you know, the people who are reviewing your article are, you know, experts in your field, and they're aware of what everybody in your field is sort of working on. So I think it would be very easy for people to guess who wrote that article or what group it came from.
So we have about 10 minutes.
Really related from the IEEE, we talked about the articles you write, the data you create, and metrics. Have any of you signed up for an ORCID identifier? If so, how are you using the identifier?
I have an ORCID identifier. I make sure it's on all the papers that I publish. It's another thing I'm still trying to figure out how to maximize the potential of. I'm not quite sure on that. Getting used to it.
Yeah, I have one, and actually just the other day I kind of discovered that it was, I'm trying to be a little bit better about managing my kind of presence. Like if you search for me through various means, what comes up. So I just discovered this the other day, so I was trying to organize things a little bit.
I do not have one.
I do not.
My question is about sort of how non-traditional publishing fits into like professional development and professional advancement. We're very much a non-traditional publisher, and I think something that came up in the keynote yesterday is that there's more and more things that are sort of non-traditional that are outlets for scholarship and for research to publish, whether it's new journals or it's the only journals or even entirely new formats, and that a lot of academics and a lot of scholars wish that that could be beneficial to them in their professional advancement, but that it's usually not because academia just kind of doesn't know what to do with it. They don't really know how to measure it. They don't know how to quantify its credibility and its value. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you experience, and I'm wondering if in your field and in your work, if you observe any trends or any sort of changes in attitude about if that is eventually going to be something that is as important as publishing in a high impact print journal, or if it's just kind of a losing battle.
So I'll give you a second there. The question is around non-traditional publishing and how it's impacting your decisions for professional development.
So I have done blogging also, right? And some of my blog posts have had 10 times as many views as my highest cited paper, right? And it's difficult, right? And I don't write as much on my blog anymore as I used to, just because I'm worried about tenure and all of that stuff, right? And so these things, they need to be adopted by a field as a whole. I think you'll continue to hear that we all wish that we could do these things a little bit better. And I know some big name scientists who say, I wish I could just publish my stuff on my own and have that count. And but we've got to figure out peer review and all of that process to go along with it as well. I don't know the answer to that question. I think all of us, both in the academic and research worlds, and in the publishing world and in the grant funding world, we're all waiting on someone to move first. No one's moving, and we're all looking to everyone else to move first. I don't know. It's something that would be good, but I don't know. Everyone's hesitant to do anything about it.
So I know as someone who's kind of leaving the traditional academic environment, I've done a lot of that this year. Op-eds, blog posts, tweets, written all of it, and it's incredibly powerful, the reach that you get, you know. But looking back from a purely academic perspective, in our lab, we talked about doing a lot of these things, kind of using some social media, blogging. We never really got any of them off the ground, simply a lot due to time, and we just didn't know kind of how to do it, but also how, like, who was going to care other than, you know, our audience, but within the academic community, were you going to get credit for it? Because it takes a lot of time to develop, or at least for me, I'm personally wasn't that great at those things initially. So there is the question of where's the reward going to come from, because it's very much not clear, at least wasn't to our lab as researchers. But I've seen the power of it now, so I think the people that contribute to that more are people that are kind of leaving the pure academic space, so I don't know how to create that bridge.
Yeah, there's no reward for it. I mean,
Yeah.
Again, at a small university, I have more ability to look at some of these things than you know, colleagues of mine at Research One universities, right? Because my research shouldn't. There's not as much demand on me to do research and get grants as my friends who are at bigger schools. You know, that being said, there's still no reward for me there. And I have to think wisely about, well, if I'm going to, again, it comes back to time. If I'm going to spend my time working on this, right, is that time useful or is that time not useful? And again, until there's some reward system put in place or some, you know, maybe this gets to the alt metrics, and if those are valued more, you know, through, for a researcher, through the funding agencies, then sure, then people will do more of that.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. I'm sorry, Shelby, did you?
No, well, I think for some of these journals that you know, we don't publish in as frequently, having like special editions that are focused on one topic are a really great way to get people to contribute to that. I mean, it might still be hard to get a lot of, you know, researchers on board with that, but I think that's a good way when you're then in that field to, you can just pick up this one special edition and sort of see all these focused topics on one subject, and so that might be a good way to draw people to that format.
So I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yes?
I was just wondering, we're publishers are starting to spend more time, as we should, learning what you all, what your pain points are, and how we can help with that. But now that we've been firing questions at you, I wonder if you have any questions for us, or if you have sort of 2 sentences with a room full of journal publishers, something that we should know, if you want us to know before we leave.
Thank you for that.
I want to know what the editor's biases are. We all have biases in what we think are interesting, right? And we talk about impact factor as being the important, like, this is important research. It has an impact factor of this. But as journal editors and publishers, you're gatekeepers for all of that. And all of you have some sort of bias in determining that. And we think we can get rid of that through peer review, but it doesn't necessarily happen. What are your biases? I think that's one thing that we would love to know.
Does somebody want to take it? Okay, any other questions?
I don't know if it's more of a comment really than a question, but one thing I think that could be improved is maybe more engagement with the authors. I know that generally when you submit, it just kind of goes, and then depending on the journal, maybe it's a month, maybe it's 10 weeks till you hear back. There's not really interaction with the editor, and I don't necessarily know what the right format that is, but maybe with someone helping with the formatting, or maybe even helping tell the story. You know, you certainly don't want to get into the data or necessarily the interpretation, but maybe that's somewhere, or the researcher could or the author could feel more engaged in the publishing process, because right now it feels completely out of your hands. Once you hit the send button, you're just waiting for the reply.
I like that point. Just from the standpoint of, you know, now with open access and researchers really starting to see, well, what are our libraries paying for this? What are they paying for that? You know, seeing the University of California school system just drop a couple of journals was really eye-opening for a lot of us, I think. Getting value from interaction with the editors, I think, could be a really great way to to push the really the hidden values of journals and what can be done with the journal and a good editor.
Yeah, and to expand on that a little bit, now and more in the congressional and space and with AAAS, we talk a lot about communication of science, a lot of times to non-traditional audiences. And it was kind of weird thinking back on the process in graduate school and postdoc. You know, and the grants always want these broader impacts and all these things you're going to do. And we tried to come up with these really great ideas, but I personally am not a social media user. I don't enjoy it, so I just don't do it. And you try and think you're going to, but it's just a reality that I'm not great at it, so I'm not going to do it. That may be another area that publishers could help. You know, you guys kind of have this expertise in finding an audience, whereas researchers, sometimes we just really like being in lab. You know, there's obviously a spectrum there, but maybe that's another area to kind of help the researchers tell their story.
Yeah, I second that. I also don't really, you know, just in preparing for this, I was thinking about, do I use social media at all to promote my work, and I really don't, and it seems like that should be the publisher's job. You know, you're publishing the work and getting it out there, so shouldn't social media be a part of that? So that would be really great to see more of that.
No, those all sound like great ideas.
I think that was really the perfect question to end this. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Paul, Matt, Shelby, Clayton.